Hi, everybody. Welcome to our latest episode of Let's Be Direct. This is a LaneAxis podcast in which we discuss all things trucking, supply chain, and the future of the industry, which, as we always say, is going direct. My name is Andrew Rivera. I'm the head of marketing for LaneAxis, joined as always by my cohorts here, Johnny Nguyen. He's our head of shipper partnerships, and by CEO and LaneAxis founder, Rick Burnett. So, guys, today's topic, something we've been hearing about for decades, literally, the so-called driver shortage. And yeah, I put that in air quotes because, frankly, we as a company sort of challenge the notion that there is a driver shortage, as do a lot of other entities, a lot of high-ranking, people in the trucking industry. But there are some associations, particularly some lobbying groups, and I'll point out specifically the ATA, American Trucking Associations with an S. They're the ones who are, it seems, constantly pushing the narrative that we are anywhere from 60 to 80,000 drivers short. Now, when you consider the fact that in general there are 3.5 million active drivers, and by one account there's 10 million Americans with CDLs, right off the bat, right there, that kind of raises my antenna of like, really? So, Rick, I'll just start with you. Driver shortage, real or not real?
I would challenge what that actually means. What does driver shortage actually means? Now, the term means that there is a shortage of drivers, right? There's demand that is out there, and there isn't drivers willing to be truck drivers in order to fulfill that demand. I would challenge that because there are ample guys that like to drive, and there are ample guys that want to be truck drivers. I think that's pointed to the number of DOT carriers that's been issued or license or authority that has been issued over the last year or two. And there's message out there that there is over 1 million too many DOT carriers that's out there. So, I think the reason we say challenge is because which one is it? Is it a driver shortage, or is there too many, DOT? Is there too many trucking companies? Because those are two different conversations that really are saying the same thing. And, the way that we look at it as far as lane access is that the trucking company is going to have an ebbs and flows. And there's a number of trucking companies that go out of business every year. And that's a lot of different reasons for that. There's not a singular point that you can say trucking companies go out of business because of this reason. There's all kinds of businesses go out of business because of operational failure, because of cost too high, because of their various different things that contribute to that, right? And so specifically in the driver shortage, I always challenge that because I know that there's guys that want to drive and there's guys that want to be truck drivers. And so there's not a shortage as far as truck drivers. Now there is a shortage of an increased number of guys that are fed up and a shortage of the point that they don't want to mess with this anymore. And that I think is real. And the frustration level, quite frankly, I've been in a decade of building this and, I've never seen it like this in all my years in transportation. It covers several decades. And I think it's heightened because just the amount of frustration that's being poured on the independents. So is the driver shortage an independent number, or is a driver shortage a company number from a company standpoint? And, to classify a driver shortage, I think you have to classify into the segment that driver shortage represents. So we know statistically that 97% of this industry is smaller independent, right? And you literally have, 1.67 million. There's depends on the database that you pull at the particular time, but of 10 trucks or less. And so, you know, in the driver shortage narrative that's out there, I would say what's the initiative behind why they're pushing a driver shortage? And that's what I would say would be the challenge to find out.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because I went hunting for that answer. And frankly, the don't reflect very well on some of the industry players. One argument is that some bigger trucking companies are looking for federal subsidies to recruit and train new drivers. So they're looking for government handouts and pushing the shortage furthers that cause. Purchase lease agreements is another one. They want to get guys in there to lease one of their trucks, and statistically, only I think it's 10% or less actually end up owning their trucks because the turnover rate, as we know, for most trucking companies is 90%, 100%. It's been as high as 300% for some companies. So neither of those reasons, frankly, are good for the industry. Now, my pushback comes from some other stats that are much more relevant to what we're talking about. One is, and we talk about this a lot, every year, U.S. trucks drive 20 to 30 billion empty miles. Now, what does that tell you? There's plenty of capacity out there. There's plenty of drivers out there. Otherwise, there wouldn't be 20 to 30 billion empty miles. 500,000 CDLs, new CDLs are issued every year. So based on that, it comes down to the age-old question: is it a driver shortage problem or a driver retention problem? To me, it's clear it's a driver retention problem.
I would agree. Actually, it's the driver retention because I just thinking in terms of what makes right now in this lands and in this climate, what makes being a driver like attractive. So a lot of guys, I guess what's adding to the argument of driver shortages, keeping the guys who got into the space or guys who've been doing this, they're probably retiring early, as well. And what's going to be attractive for this next generation of drivers to get into this space?
So do you, based on those stats, empty miles, number of CDLs, I mean, would you agree, Rick, that there's more than enough drivers out there to satisfy the demand? I mean, look, with the exception of the COVID debacle, there's really been no major long-term supply chain disruptions over the last couple of decades, right? I mean,
Well, there's been the '08 collapse. I mean, that pushed a lot of pressure, and especially into certain industries like automotive, that actually, crippled a lot of trucking companies because they just wrote off the invoices of loads that were already delivered because they pay in 60, 90 days. And, they just wrote those off because during that failure part, so yeah, I would say every decade has had its period of challenges within the supply chain for various different reasons. I think the thing that's constant is that through the economies up and down and there's guys constantly every year wanting to get into trucking, and there's guys that don't make it. And I think my challenge to the industry is one thing that's 100% universal across all independents, at least, is that they don't want more regulation.
Yeah.
And if we start pushing the narrative where there's too many authorized DOT carriers, there's too many carriers out there, you could be taking the position of forcing the government to put regulations around how many that they actually allow every year. And then that moves into, expression of freedom. And whether a guy's going to make it or not isn't another guy's determining factor on whether he's going to be successful or not. Some guys work more than other ones. Some guys are smarter than other ones as far as their expenses, and they're more conscious of that. And so I think that part, let the water level rise to what it is. But the point of being a driver shortage is a narrative. And it's a narrative that has an agenda behind it. that agenda is not bringing efficiency and bringing value to the supply chain. And quite frankly, it's not bringing in value to the 97%. It is a narrative that's being pushed by larger companies because they have an incentive behind what they want to do.
Right. So sorry, Diane, I know you want to jump in here, but I did find an interesting study from Atri, the American Transportation Research Institute. So this speaks to the disconnect, I think, on the part of a lot of people in the industry. So they asked commercial drivers what their top concerns were. Presumably, most of them are independent drivers. And then they asked motor carriers, presumably larger motor carriers, what they thought were the biggest issues. Commercial drivers, for hire drivers mostly, their number one concern is pay, truck parking. Then it goes down to detention, fuel prices, driver training standards, HOS, all that. Nowhere do they mention that a driver shortage is a problem. Now, stands to reason they wouldn't say that because they have a job and they probably don't want more people coming in taking their freight. But on the motor carrier side, driver shortage is the number one concern. So I think this really speaks to the disconnect in the industry, don't you think, Johnny? That some people see the biggest problems over here, and the guys who are actually hauling the freight see the biggest problems over here.
Yeah, it's pretty far apart.
Yeah. Now I will give credit to one of the mega carriers, JB Hunt. One of their executives recently said, "I believe we have plenty of drivers. We don't use them very well." Now, I'm not sure who he's referring to as we, JB Hunt, or the industry. I mean, JB Hunt, frankly, was part of our study in purchase transportation, and they basically subcontract about 50% of their freight. So even JB Hunt says they don't believe there's a driver shortage. So again, I think so. Based on that, it's really the way drivers are being treated, the way they're being paid. They're making half as much as they did in 1980, when deregulation kicked in. Wouldn't you agree? It just comes down to treating drivers better.
Yeah, I think, the pandemic brought into a stoppage, brought into an increase in rates because they needed to move products in a relatively quicker way. There was government money being thrown out there, and greed set in. And now that the aftermath of that period of time is what we're dealing with now, and there is not one thing, and there's probably more than 10 of issues that have arisen out of that pocket of time. There are WhatsApp groups out there that of guys that are India that are getting loads off load boards, double, triple brokering them there. And that's one example of many that are going on that, driver shortage in that parameter, I think for this conversation, we've already covered. Really, the issue is what's the issues in the industry, and that's the part of the conversation we need to pick up and talk about how do you correct and start turning this Titanic ship that's going down this way at 40 knots, and how do you turn the rudder, and even though it's starting to turn internally within this big old ship, you're not seeing any signs of this because there's too much weight and momentum going this way. But eventually it will start to turn. And, that part is what I think is next week's episode, is turning the Titanic into this, I would say, post era of the pandemic that pushed greed and has pushed, profits in the managed service part of this business into an area that it's never seen before. And now there is a lot of illegality going on. It's an unregulated, and it's almost like the Wild West in the form of these rates. And whoever has the gold makes the rules. And in this scenario, the gold is the freight. and whoever controls the freight controls the industry. And so that's the part of the conversation that we need to get into.
And I think it's worth mentioning one of the issues that is often cited as contributing to the so-called driver shortage is detention time. A lot of people say that's the main problem because obviously drivers aren't getting paid when they're sitting still, so they're making less money. They're stuck idling or because of HOS limits, so they can't go out and get more freight basically to sort of supplement this so-called shortage.
Well, I mean, if you look at that particular scenario, okay, so the driver is on a regulated amount of time that he can drive in a 24-hour period and weekly. So the only way he makes money is actually moving. Okay. So when you and if he has no data and nobody has insight, or the data is being input by somebody that's in Chicago that has subcontracted that loadout, and they have no real-time visibility in that truck or where he is or where he's at and when he got there, all the different important things, then that frustration level increases to a point that over a period of time, he just says, I'm done. Because I can't make money sitting here 6 hours waiting to get it unloaded. And then I run out of hours, and then I have to do a reset, and I can't get the load delivered, and I can't get paid on it. And then, and so, network visibility and data into the network that can be quantifiable will start to reduce this driver retention if it's been through data proven that the driver retention is a fault of this smaller independent network that's frustrated and they're leaving because of these issues. And that's how you're going to, in the future, you're going to look in 10 years from now, you're going to be able to look and see what are the issues and what's the data tell you behind the issues, because you're going to have a network and you're going to have quantifiable data, and you're going to be able to isolate these things and say, yes, we do have a driver shortage and this is a way to correct it, or no, we don't because of this, right? And so the point, I think, in driver shortage is the point in every topic that we could bring up in here. And there's no data behind any of these points. It's guys making up a narrative for a personal agenda that they don't have statistical data behind that can prove that this is a point that they need to address.
So let me pose this question to both of you, and I'll start with you, Johnny, since you're our head of shipper partnerships. In theory, who would be most adversely affected by a driver shortage? It would be shippers, right? So you talk to shippers every day. Do you ever hear them complain about a driver shortage? And I'm not including hot loads that need to be moved in an instant. Those are one-offs. But
the only concern they bring up to me is is having access to. The only issue they really bring up to me is about having access to various different direct carriers. That's the reason why they joined to begin with, because they fear that if their broker can't fulfill the load, then they don't know how to recruit further more carriers. So that's the basis of most of our conversations, is to build that capacity. We can be a capacity partner for them. So yeah.
So Rick, you've obviously have a lot of connections and have had a lot of conversations with shippers. Do you ever hear them complain about a shortage?
Well, I don't think the shortage really gets to them, and because there's no network that they can go to, so they're not feeling that shortage. They're given what they feel is an increase of rate because there isn't capacity to move their stuff, and then there's statistical information that the managed service part of this business, which is the $200+ billion, is saying, well, you were paying $2,000, you got to pay $2,300 now because we can't find a carrier. Yes or no? And he's like, so they don't say you got to pay $2,300 because it's a driver shortage, right? They say it's because who's controlling the truck capacity? Well, it's the large trucking companies, or it's the large, or the broker or the 3PL. They're controlling the truck capacity. So that conversation of that, they're not really feeling the truck shortage either, because they've got a sea of independent carriers they got access to whenever they need it, right? And so the two sides that aren't affected into the driver shortage, the two sides that's actually doing the business, and that's a shipper and a carrier. And the middle would be the conversation about driver shortage, right? Because less trucks means that, they have less margin because they have to move it with this particular rate because, they need to get the load moved. If they've got a lot of options, then they can continue to drive that price down to those, 97% of the time it's to the independents, because statistically that's what the industry is. And so, you know, beating up on a conversation about whether there is driver shortage and whether there isn't is an agenda that's being pushed and a narrative that's being pushed by somebody that has to get something done for an internal reason. It's not effectively trying to move positive conversation that's going to solve the inefficiencies that are in the network of transportation. And that's the supply chain. And so, the reality of the industry moving direct, yes, that is a personal mission because we built the system to do it. But effectively, it is the number one narrative that should be pushed to the industry because it's the most efficient. And everything else that you talk about is going to add layers of complication and cost into, the industry itself.
I got a question to I want to get your thoughts on. I've heard one or several states or some states have proposed lowering the licensing to get a CDL to 18 years old. What are your thoughts on that? That was a proposed solution for addressing driver shortage. An 18-year-old behind.
Yeah. I mean, we've all been 18 before.
Yes.
And I can speak for myself, and that's the only one I can say. I wasn't ready to get behind a 50,000-pound vehicle at 18. I just wasn't mature enough. Now, some people might be. How do we make the decision and determination between who is, because this isn't about whether somebody has the capability of backing a truck up and getting a CDL license. This is really about, does he have the maturity level to understand, and has he been in a position long enough to understand exactly what power he has behind him at the wheel? And, I can tell you that every year that you get from 18 to 19, 19 to 20, 20 to 21, 21 to 22, you gain experience. That is a massive amount. I mean, and so if somebody's asking me a personal opinion, whether I think 18 years old is too young to allow somebody to have a CDL, in my opinion, yes. And not because he doesn't have the capability of driving a truck. It is a matter of maturity to understand all the various different things when you go on the road. And then, the people that are making that decision, if you're sitting in the highway and you got your car with your wife and your 3 kids, do you want to run the risk of an 18-year-old driving by you and wanting to get home for a certain reason that maybe a person that's a little bit more mature is going to understand what that is? I don't know. But I would challenge that being approved.
Yeah, definitely one of the strongest argument was public safety on the highways and so forth. So,
Well, however, trucks these days are obviously much more advanced. They're easier to drive, frankly, because back in the days there were no automatic trucks. You're changing, I don't know how many gears, but 18 gears, sometimes with 2 stick shifts, right? And now trucks are much easier to drive. They're automatic. They have speed limiters and all kinds of tech and tools to kind of make it easier. Does that change anything as far as maybe allowing 18-year-olds to drive? Just the fact that trucks, frankly, are easier to drive nowadays.
I mean, it doesn't for me because, again, my point was maturity level to understand exactly what you're behind. and what is, if you lose focus, what is the potential damage that you're rolling 75 miles down the road and you look at your phone and the tracks stop and you lose focus for 3 seconds. And in a car, you might hit the one in front of you and maybe bump into the next one. In a semi, you're going to roll 5, 6, 7 deep. That's a different conversation. That's a different level of risk. And that's something that the legislative body needs to really understand. And quite frankly, FMCSA and the DOT, they're about safety. That's why they went to electronic logging, because they wanted to remove guys running 30 hours straight and using 2 separate logbooks, and and they're getting tired and fatalities. Now, I'm not saying electronic logging devices was the answer or wasn't. It's not my point. The point is that they pushed safety on the roads and the reason, and with that narrative and their objective, I don't see how they would then turn around and allow somebody that's 18 get behind a wheel.
And also just to touch on what I think might be another reason to support the narrative, why there's a narrative for driver shortage is there's a growing amount of investment in autonomous trucks and that whole movement. Just what are your thoughts on these companies kind of taking on autonomous trucking and having driverless, essentially, driverless trucks?
Well, people ask me that, and the first reason why they ask me is because they think it's going to affect our software company, and we're a software and we have nothing, so it wouldn't. Do I think autonomous trucks are in the near future? I don't. And that's only because look at all of the inefficiencies that exist in this industry today, the manual processes that are still going on, the phone calls, the paperwork. I mean, if you have, it's stepping stones. We didn't go from no internet to everybody having a smartphone in the next year, right? It was a progression. And the progression was years of being businesses established and growing on the World Wide Web, to then introducing a two-way radio, and then introducing, it's a progression, right? To the point to where there was a smartphone, everybody downloads the app and everybody's connected all over. And that's really, quite frankly, only happened in the last 10 years. And prior to that, you had, 30 years of the internet being out, So I think that eventually there's segments that will happen, but I'm saying that is a decade plus of being a reality.
Yeah, I would say definitely here in America it's a whiles away. In other nations and countries, they've incorporated that, I believe, or in newer cities that are built with this already in mind, like in the Middle East, in Dubai and so forth. There's a lot of
Right, but you're talking about an area that doesn't have the infrastructure of the U.S. and the number of trucking companies and the regulation part of what they're a government initiative putting it down within, that's been a controlled city, that's been, that's a use case.
Yeah.
That's not a solution for a country today, and not that I have anything against autonomous. I think it's going to be efficient. I think it's like progression of anything. You're not going to stop technology. I mean, it's going to move forward. It's how do you adapt and how do you create and how do you, utilize it in bringing efficiency. And, but I personally think in the U.S. it's nowhere near right now. Then you might have segments where it can be, like the yard in Long Beach, it could take an autonomous truck to a distribution center that's a regular route and things like that. And I think that that's a use case that could happen, but
like
the
big
overall,
cities.
truckload, less than truckload, and the amount of, coordination it takes,
So I do want to just briefly bring up another party that we've sort of talked about it, who I think benefits from this narrative, and that's freight brokers. Because as we've talked a lot in the past, brokers tend to post the same loads across multiple load boards, posting phantom loads. And one of the big reasons, right, is to recruit new carriers. So I think they benefit from this narrative as well. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look, the more chaotic the supply chain is, the better it is for them. Let's just be honest. The last people that are really looking to build efficiency is your freight brokers, you know. And so by having the narrative out there, this driver shortage, and they gotta go, look, I just can't find a truck for that. I can't move it. And that's going to increase the rates to the shipper. Doesn't increase the rates to the carrier. It increases the margin middle, the profit margin of what they get, because they can push that narrative out to their shippers, you know. And so anytime you look at an entity that we're on the verge of this industry transforming, we're at the front end of this. And, you know, transforming this industry into a data-driven, network visibility, efficient machine is something that is going to happen in the next 5 years. And I think how quickly is going to, well, it depends on when major shippers really realize the amount of cost that's costing them to buy capacity and to purchase transportation and locking up lanes into annual contracted rates. When they start figuring out, because ultimately the 97% is hauling that freight anyway. And once they start realizing that, and then they start to go direct by building their network of independents, you're going to see a lot of these narratives go away.
Yeah. So before we wrap up our conversation today, let's talk about solutions, right? Now, apart from LaneAxis, which we're going to get into, look, it's going to be self-serving because we think we have a great solution. But I think truckers, we've reached the point where they need to be paid by the hour and not the mile. That will help with retention. And then artificial intelligence, which we are employing in the LaneAxis platform, will identify available capacity, you know, when and where it's needed. And I'll turn it over to you to talk about more specifically how a direct network is going to solve this problem.
Well, I mean, it's not my opinion that we should pay a trucker by the hour. That's not something that I support, because then you're removing the freedom. You're moving him into an employee status. And if you look at, and I know this because over the decade, I've talked to hundreds of truckers over the years. The number one question I always ask them is, why are you an independent? Why do you work for an independent company and not for a large trucking company? And 100% of the time they go, I want my freedom. I want to drive a truck and I want to be hassled with all these other blah, 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 right? And so being independent means that you can control your own destiny. You can go where you want to go and be home when you want to be home and run your business. And so paying a guy by the hour is not the answer. What you want to give him is you want to give him options. And if you think about your options, it's like he gets into a network, he gets into shippers, and you think about that funnel because the shipper is going to control his carriers you have direct relationships with, right? And so that independent is getting into these funnels. And my message to him is get into thousands of funnels where now you have access to freight wherever you're going. And now what happens is that when you want to start going somewhere, you go in those different funnels and look at the options in advance, days, weeks in advance. And then the collective power behind the network that you're in that represents 97% that is coming together to bring efficiency into the network by going direct, eliminating $200 billion of fees, and then benefiting from every dollar that he's spending in either a discount or a rebate. Now, when he makes $10,000 a week, instead of having $9,000 in expenses, he has $6,500 in expenses. And so in the whole equation, we don't want to dictate what the guy can make and what he can't make. That's trucking. What we want to help him is become more profitable. Eliminate the empty miles. Network visibility is going to do that because he's going to have options wherever he's at. And the network is going to be able to contract, verify, tender a load, and get paid immediately. immediately being having access to that shipper, negotiating with that shipper, confirming it, and then after the load's delivered, 24 hours later, the payment is released to them. It's all secured within a network. And so the point of the future in where the supply chain is going is in a network. What LaneAxis, our mission is to build the independent network, right? If you look at the different, there was Google, there was Bing, there was Yahoo, there was different search engines, but Google became the brand, right? Because they won that war. People go look it up, go Google it, right? They become the brand. And what LaneAxis wants to be is we want to be the brand. We want to be the owner, operator, independent guy's brand, knowing that we are behind them. And everything that we do is in their interest because the system that we built is for them and for their interest. So not only, we don't have anything to do with the rates. You have everything to do with the rates because you're talking with the guy that's got the rates. If you're an independent carrier and you're a shipper, you are talking with him. We are just behind, we're the machine behind the background. We're the Google, if you will, that's running this algorithm that allows this communication and this conversation to go on directly and then be confirmed. And we're guaranteeing you, the carrier, that he's going to pay you because that payment is secure when you get the rate confirmation. So we've just built a system that allows these two parties to come together.
All right. And with that, look, it's just further confirmation that going direct solves a lot of the problems in the industry. And if that's self-serving, it's self-serving, but that's what we're doing at LaneAxis. All right, fellas, good conversation. Appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us for this latest edition of Let's Be Direct. Stay safe out there on the roads, and we will see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.